Hey, how's it going, everybody? So, post-reading today, pages 48 through 52. There are the four focus questions you should have already seen, either up on the board or in just a basic PowerPoint before we began the reading. I didn't do a pre-reading video for this one, so let's just jump into it. One of the focus questions was having you look at the different articles, and you will need to be able to list out each of these articles. And really, to be honest, the first six are the important ones. The seventh article of the Constitution is simply the ratification process. It's a legal statement saying that everything in the document and the signers acknowledge that it's a legitimate document. So you don't need to know about Article 7, but the other ones you do need to know about. Legislative branch is Congress. The executive branch is going to be the presidency. The judicial branch is going to be the Supreme Court and lower courts. State-to-state relations is really important because it's how states work with each other. We have things like the Commerce Clause and the Full Faith and Credit Clause that we're going to talk about later on in more detail, but that are really important, and you're going to have cards on both of those too. The amendment process, which again is very important and is one of the focus questions for today. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, which you guys have already done no card for too, so those are all important. One little note about the judicial branch, and let me just go ahead and click on it real quick, is Marbury versus Madison. And it's a court case that happened not too long after the Constitution was ratified. But basically it established the principle of judicial review. And I forgot to highlight judicial review because that is one of your vocabulary words, judicial review. Empowers the Supreme Court to nullify or to void the acts of the legislative branch or the executive. So if Congress passes a law or a bill and the president signs it and the Supreme Court deems it unconstitutional, they can basically nullify it or just completely make it void and get rid of it. And that's been an important feature of the Supreme Court, especially in the last 100 years. They didn't really use it too much in the first 100 years of America, but they've used it heavily in the last 100. So judicial review, again, is one of your vocabulary terms. I should have highlighted that, my fault. So it's really important, and what's crazy is that the Supreme Court actually gave themselves that power. So the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, John Marshall, when they decided on it, he wrote the deciding opinion, and he basically said that, because of the nature of courts and the idea that it's the third branch and it's supposed to have checks and balances and its own powers, that they have the power to essentially nullify any unconstitutional acts that the other two branches do. So, and nobody challenged it, and it kind of just went along and everybody agreed with it, mainly because Alexander Hamilton discussed the notion of judicial review in Federalist 78. Alexander Hamilton. Oh, wrong Alexander Hamilton. This guy right here. So he discussed it in Federalist 78, talked about what judicial review would be, and we're going to get more to the Federalist Papers in just a minute here. So let's go ahead and go back. And the very first thing we're going to cover, and it's one of the things you guys have to know, is the amendment process. So how do we actually change the literal wording of the Constitution? Now there's two things that happen here. When Congress just passes a law and the president signs it, or the Supreme Court has a piece of judicial review, they're changing the idea of the Constitution, but they're not changing the actual wording of the Constitution. And so we have to differentiate between those two things. One's an informal thing, passing laws every year, passing judicial review. Those are informal changes to the Constitution. What's nice is that you can go back and change those real easy whenever you need to. You just go back and modify an existing law. But if you actually want to change the official wording of the Constitution, that's what we call a formal amendment. Okay, a formal change to the Constitution. Those are much more difficult. And what you need, and there's 4 different ways to do this. I only care about one way because that's been done 26 out of 27 times, is that you need 2/3 of Congress, which means 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate, to propose an amendment, and then they send it to the states. And you need 3/4 of the state legislatures, which means this is state governments. This is like our government in Sacramento, or the one in Olympia, Washington, or Virginia City in Nevada. They're the ones who approve this, not the voters, but the state legislatures. So it's really important to understand that it's a 2-step process. 2/3 of Congress, that means 2/3 of each house, proposes it, and then 3/4 of the states have to approve it. Now, what's interesting here is that we don't mention the president or the Supreme Court. So this is a way to pass laws to make them permanent in America, and you bypass the Supreme Court and the president. They have no say in this process, except maybe on TV, and the president would come on and say it's a bad idea. But if Congress did it and the states approved it, the president would have to abide by it because it's now part of the Constitution and it's law of the land. So this has really been the one way that's been done, like I said, 26 out of 27 times. The 27th was this deal right here at the bottom. And that's only happened once, and we don't need to talk about that because basically this is the way it happens from now on. And I think that's it. Okay. Oh, important, this is the idea of federalism, because here, if we go back, you have the national government working with state governments. This is that dual sovereignty. So federalism, this is the idea of federalism in action on the most fundamental level. If we have to change the Constitution, federalism has to be working. So it has to be the national government and the state governments working together to make a change to the Constitution. All right. Next up, you get to differentiate between anti-federalists and federalists. Real easy here. I underlined it already for you. Federalists supported the idea of the new Constitution. Anti-federalists opposed the Constitution, and they thought the Articles of Confederation were working just fine, and we should stay that way. Mainly because they were concerned with too much power at the national level. And that was what their fear was, and they were kind of justified because all the fears they had about too much power at the national level have all become true, partly through necessity and having such a large nation. So we'll get back into that when we get to federalism. But we have federalists supporting the Constitution, anti-federalists opposing it. It's pretty easy, pretty straightforward. Next thing we have, and kind of have to tie this in with the federalists, are the Federal Papers, or the Federalist Papers. And it's a series of essays that were written in New York to convince the people of New York to ratify this new Constitution. Because if you go back to this amendment process, the members of the Congressional Congress proposed this new Constitution, and they needed 3/4 of the states to approve it. So the states had to, each state legislature, each state government had to approve it. And they had to convince the voters who would then put pressure on their state governments. So the Federalist Papers are written, and kind of a fun, interesting fact, or just tidbit of history, is that the Federalist Papers are the owner's manual to the Constitution. So when they wrote the Constitution, these guys actually helped write the bulk of the Constitution. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton were key figures in the drafting of the Constitution. So they actually went ahead and explained all the ideas they came up with in there. So a lot of times people will argue, well, the founders of this country, they had one idea. Well, we don't know exactly what they thought. No, we do, because they actually wrote it in the Federalist Papers. They explained why they were doing everything they did, why they came up with a 3-branch system, why they had a Supreme Court, why they had, certain amendments, they were going to add to the Constitution later on. They explained everything in detail of how the government should work. So it's the owner's manual to the Constitution. And you can see here, you've already, I think, read 2 of these now in class, and you're going to read a couple more. You don't have to read the whole thing. They're kind of boring, but I was a poli-sci major, so I had to read all of them. And that's the Federalist Papers. So they were written to convince the people to vote for the new government. Okay. On the other side, we have the anti-federalists. And it doesn't get brought up here in your notes, but one of the things, and you've already read it, is there was something called Brutus. And it was kind of an answer to the Federalist Papers. It was the anti-federalists saying, hey, here's why we shouldn't adopt this new Constitution. Here's all the problems that are going to go with it. Here are the warnings we have, and here are some suggestions. So they wrote their own response to the Federalist Papers. It's called Brutus. They don't get as much, of a spotlight in history because the Federalists were the ones who won. So the anti-federalists kind of went to the wayside a little bit. Their ideas still exist, and we'll talk about those as we talk about, our government today, because some of the ideas the anti-federalists had are still very strongly rooted in American politics even today. So one of the things the anti-federalists wanted was they argued that we needed a Bill of Rights to preserve individual liberties, because they wanted your individual rights protected by this new Constitution, because they felt that there weren't enough protections for you and I. So they argued strongly in favor of a Bill of Rights. And in fact, this is why it was eventually added to convince the anti-federalists to sign off on this new Constitution. So that's why they went ahead and did it, and add the Bill of Rights in to get everybody to sign off. Eventually they did, and Constitution was ratified in 1789. The Bill of Rights is added in 1791 because it's a process. And if you look at it right here, I think you have a card on the Bill of Rights too. Again, I didn't highlight that for some reason. The first 8 amendments in the Bill of Rights are the government's legal obligations to protect you. Okay, they have to protect you. That's why you have a right to life, well, not life, liberty, property. That's the fundamentals. But you have a right to, freedom of speech and freedom of religion. You have a right not to be thrown in prison. You have a right to an attorney and all these things. And those are in the first 8 amendments. Then we have Amendment 9. And I have you guys doing a card on this one. And it indicates a list of liberties is not exhaustive. So that means that just because it's not stated there, if the Constitution doesn't specify that you have that right or doesn't prohibit it, then it's yours anyway. So one of these things that comes up often is the right to privacy. Privacy is never mentioned in the Constitution. It's inferred in a couple of different amendments, I think Amendment 5 and 4, but it's never clearly stated. And so the 9th Amendment is where what they used when they eventually established the right to privacy, because it's not a liberty that was prohibited or given to us, but it's one that we should have anyway. So the 9th Amendment protects you and I in that certain liberties will become ours if there's no specification on it. Next one, last one that I had you guys do a card on is the 10th Amendment. And this preserves the states' rights. So if we go back to state obligations, when we're looking at the articles of the Constitution, so some states, not some states, all states have certain rights. And if they're not specified in that article and they're not prohibited in that article, they belong to states. So for instance, states have a right to issue birth certificates, driver's licenses, professional licenses, run schools, run police departments. That's the right of the state to control their own territory in that respect. And that's where when we get into federalism, we're going to be talking about dual federalism, and you're going to have those two spheres, those two, like the overlap, the Venn diagram, state powers, federal powers, and then you're going to have a little bit of overlap in the middle because they do share some powers. So we'll get into that when we start talking about federalism very soon. And I think those are your notes for today. If you have any questions, feel free to message me, and I will talk to you guys later.